Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webinar today, Fewer and Older, Population and Demographic Challenges in Rural Saskatchewan, hosted by Dr. Mozami, Professor of Economics at Lakehead University. So my name is Amber Hawes, and I'm the Senior Communications and Marketing Lead at Essential Skills Ontario. So before we get started, I just wanted to give you a few instructions. At the right-hand side of your screen is your GoToWebinar dashboard. There you can chat with each other in the chat pane and ask questions. If it's a technical question, I will try my best to assist you. And if you have any questions about the content, feel free to just type them in the chat pane, and I'll ask Dr. Mozami throughout the webinar as well as at the end. So I'll just give you a little bit of background of Dr. Mozami. He's a professor of economics and econometrics at Lakehead University, and he's written extensively on economic development opportunities and challenges in Northern Ontario. He's also written many reports on forestry and mining industries in both Ontario and Canada, and is also an expert on Aboriginal economic development and has written extensively on Aboriginal social and economic development issues. So Dr. Mozami, I will turn it over to you to begin the presentation.
Oh, thank you very much. The main objective of today's presentation is to analyze past, present, and future demographic changes in the province of Saskatchewan. The study focuses on 4 population groups: total population, Francophone population, Aboriginal population, and immigrants. We examine various socioeconomic trends and characteristics of rural and urban population. We also look at the earning differential between rural and urban regions and try to explain what are the factors that explain the differential earnings of these two groups of people. For that, we develop a human capital index, which is a good contribution of this report, which basically measures the human capital composition of the labor force or the working age population, and see whether the differences between the human capital content of the workforce is what explains the earning differential between rural and urban population. Then we look at some population projections for rural and urban regions based on the assumption that current trends and characteristics of the province economic conditions continue. Finally, we look at we summarize our report and provide some new information regarding the importance of investment in education. Population trends in Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan is basically one of the lowest population, has one of the lowest population densities among all Canadian provinces. On average, about 1.7 persons per square kilometer. Only Newfoundland has a lower density. However, there are significant differences between the population densities among different parts of Saskatchewan. For example, northern regions has a population density of 0.1 per square kilometer, and then the population density exceeds 3,000 persons per square kilometer in some residential areas in Saskatoon and Regina. When we look at the population trend in Saskatchewan, we observe something interesting, that the population has been effectively at or near 1 million people for the past 80 years. It declined here because of the drought and depression, then increased when economic conditions improved, declined when economic conditions deteriorated, and increased significantly in 2006-2011 because of significantly better economic conditions. The growth rate of the province has been above the Canadian national rate, 4-5%. High commodity prices has helped. So basically population and employment and population change when economic conditions change. When economic conditions improve, employment condition improves, and then population in migration happens and population increases. When economic conditions deteriorate, out-migration happens, population declines. when we look at the growth rate of population, we can observe hypothetically, we can draw some sort of a cycle that population here has been going down, then has been going up, then it's been going down, then has been going up. So this is very much the whole story, that the economic cycles influence or cause population and employment trends. So these basically a cycle mimicking the changes in the economic fortune of the province during the 2006-11. Significant in-migration has happened to the province. In-migration not only from other provinces, but immigration from other provinces, even though the province has not really been attracting and or keeping the immigrants in the past. But in this past era, the past 5, 6, 7 years, has been a difference, significant difference between this period and the previous periods. This is an interesting graph. It shows basically the ratio of working age population to non-working age population, to youth and to seniors. The green ones is Canada, the ratio for Canada. The blue one was 2001. The population, the working population to youth was 2.99, about 3% working person per each person under the age of 15. Here we had 4.5 working person per each senior. In 2011 it increased, the working population increased because of the significant inflow of working age people to the province during that period. But when we look at the ratios for Saskatchewan and ratio for Canada, we see that we are still below the national level. So decreasing the gap between the dependency ratios, they call them, in Saskatchewan and the national levels is one of those goals that the province can basically strive to achieve in the long run. The graph that I just showed you in terms of the population, working age population being lower than Canada compared to non-working age also is reflected here. The dependency ratios that we just saw suggest a different age distribution in Saskatchewan compared to Canada. You see that here we have more youth, more younger people below the age of 25, and more seniors above age 65, and fewer working age population. This is basically 2011, after the province experienced significant inflow of working age people. So prior to that, this picture would have been worse, basically much fewer working age people prior to 2006, 2001. This is an interesting picture. This basically shows the fertility rate in Canada and in Saskatchewan. First of all, the total fertility rate, we define it as the average number of children that a woman will have over the course of her life. 2.1 is referred to as generational replacement rate. We need 2.1 children on average per woman to basically maintain have a stable population in the province. It has been around 2.1. It has always been around 2 from 1981 to 2011. In fact, when we look at the rural areas in Saskatchewan, the fertility rate is about 2.4, which is significantly above the generational replacement rate. When we look at Canada, the fertility rate has always been below. It's 1.61 now compared to about 2 in Saskatchewan. But given this picture that we have, so the natural increase, natural population increase, which is basically defined as birth minus death, the birth rates have always been higher in Saskatchewan. So why is that? The population share of the province has been declining significantly since 1930s. For instance, in 1931, the population share of the province was about 8.9%. in 1951, it went down to 6% in 1951, it went down to 4% in 1981, it went down to 3% in 2011. So what explains, even though we have higher fertility than the province, than Canada, how is it that our population share is declining significantly? The major reason has been a significant outflow of people from the province. Again, the cycle that mimics economic fortune of the province. Here, the blue one is the net interprovincial migration. We see that significant number of people moved out. Who are these people who move out? 50% of them are aged 20 to 30. So the young people are the ones who basically don't have any ties necessarily. They haven't bought a house. They haven't settled down. They can move. They are basically most mobile age group. And they are 50% of them at least are those that cohort, 20 to 30. So basically 18,000 people moved out in this 89. And then it has always been negative. This is the zero line. This red one is net immigration. See, we always had some immigration, very low compared to other provinces in Canada. 45% of immigrants, for instance, usually on average go to Ontario, 13–14% go to BC. Here, very few used to come to Saskatchewan. So this is the 18,000 is net interprovincial migration. Net immigration, if we deduct these two from each other, which is about 1600 AD to be exact. I like to be exact. Say 1600 AD to be exact, are the number of immigrants who came to the province in this year. So basically we see that has always been negative. But then in 2006, it went above the zero line. It became the green one is the net of immigrants plus the interprovincial flows. So it becomes significantly positive. It went up, but the blue line, the interprovincial, started to decline after 2007. This can be due to people who came in the expectation of finding jobs, could not find, left. So basically the flow declined. The rate of growth basically becomes negative. The flow declines. Basically in 2013, we have about 1,300 coming from other provinces to the province. But immigration has increased significantly. These are generally much younger immigrants who have come to the province, and as we are going to see later, the inflow of young immigrants has reduced the average age of immigrants in the province significantly. So that's an interesting, so this has been the reason why the population, even though fertility has been relatively high, the population has not grown significantly in the province. This shows the aging of the population. The share of people under the age of 20 has declined from 32% to 26%. The share of seniors has increased slightly, sort of, 12.7% to 14–15% in 2011. One of the important aspects of this change, demographic change, is the diversity, relates to the diversity, cultural and linguistic diversity of the province. Francophone population base declined from 17,650 in 2001 to 14,190 in 2011. Immigrant population declined from increased basically 47,635 here to 68,775. Significant increase in the immigrant population, as we just discussed. The unreserved population has increased significantly from 43,000, 44,000 to 55,000, 56,000. From 86,000 off reserve to 101,000, 102,000 in 2011. Significant growth of the Aboriginal population. Some of them are due to higher fertility rates. Some are as a result of the change in reporting and higher participation in the census. Those can all be factors explaining the significant growth of the Aboriginal population. Rural and urban demographics. What do we mean by rural? There are many different definitions of rural. One definition that Statistics Canada suggests researchers should use, and I like that definition too, is the rural and small town definition, which basically refers to rural as the population living outside census metropolitan areas and census agglomerations. Census metropolitan areas, 100,000 plus, census agglomerations, 10,000 population plus. So population living outside those areas are referred to as rural population. Another definition that is often used by Statistics Canada, and we have significant historical data on, is the population living in areas of low density and fewer than 1,000 population. So that is an alternative definition of rural. Here we have basically divided, and then the rural, when it comes to rural, we define different degrees of rurality depending on the commuting distance from these urban areas. How many of these folks in the area we call a strong link to urban regions or a strong metropolitan influenced zone, how many of them travel to this urban area to work? More than 30%. So in this region, the strong link region, more than 30% travel here in the morning, travel back. They work in these urban areas. In moderate influence zone, 35 to 30% of population workforce travels and works here and goes back. Here, 0 to 5%, very negligible. 0 to 5% in the weak zone. And here, nobody travels from here to urban areas to work. It's completely remote. So you can consider weak and no zone, no mid zones, no metropolitan influence zones as remote areas. This is less remote, and this is basically in the neighborhood of the urban areas, close to urban areas. So when we divide all the census subdivisions in the province into these different regions, we observe that about 40%, 39–40% of the census subdivisions in Saskatchewan are completely remote. About 22% are in this area, relatively remote. 26% are moderately close to urban centers, and about 6% close to urban centers, and about 7% of all census subdivisions. These are census subdivisions that 66 of them fall within census metropolitan areas and census agglomerations. So this is the distribution of 959 census subdivisions in the province to different regional distribution. Here is the population size. We excluded Regina and Saskatoon to basically from this average calculation to not bias the result. So the other census subdivisions that are in urban areas, the population size is relatively small, 3,500, and the population size in other rural areas are about 400, 500. In the remote ones are about 190. So there are these small, absolutely small communities. And on average, rural areas are about 482, 500 population. This is the most populated area, and the average sizes are also relatively large. So based on this classification of rural and urban, rural and small town classification, we see that the urban population in Saskatchewan increased by about 12.8%, 13% during 2001-2011. During the same period, rural population declined by about 1.8%, 2%, even though they experienced significant growth during the 2006-2011, the whole province, but still rural population declined slightly, urban population increased significantly. The distribution of population by degree of rurality based on the small town, rural and small town definition. So you see where people live, majority of the rural population live in relatively remote regions. This is the region where up to 5%, 0 to 5% of the population in these areas travel to urban areas to work. So basically they're pretty much isolated from urban centers. These are people who are really isolated, very remote. When we look at the population change during 2001-2011 from blue to red bars, we see that all these little strong means, moderate means, weak means, they all experienced population growth during the 2001-2011. So many of these rural areas did experience population growth as a result of the economic environment improving significantly. The only area that experienced significant population decline are the remote regions. Many of the skilled workers who lived in these areas probably moved, there is evidence to suggest that they moved to these areas to find employment when employment situation improved. This is when you use the 1,000, smaller than 1,000 and smaller than 400 per square kilometer population density as a definition of rural. This is a definition Statistics Canada has been using very frequently, and we have historical data on. So when you look at that, we basically see that from 1931 onward, the rural share of the rural population has declined significantly, and the share of the urban population has increased dramatically. This is, by the way, what we observe in many other provinces. But the fact is that if most of the minerals and natural resources that are untapped, undeveloped, are in rural areas, and if population is declining, and as we are going to see later in this report, if the human capital content is also declining, then what would happen to the development of those regions? Are we basically going to we cannot rely on the domestic labor force because of the low human capital content, then we have to import workers from other places, and then that reduces the economic impact of those developments to the province and to the people who live in those areas, and therefore causes problems. In fact, not only problems in terms of social and economic, but also the economic consequences of those developments for rural population will be very, very much diminished. When you look at the CSTs with fewer than 1,000 population, just this is to show that the picture does not change that much when we change the definition from rural and a small town to census division, the rural being a place where there are less than 1,000, fewer than 1,000 population. The picture stays very much the same as the picture that emerges when we look at the rural and a small town definition. The same when you look at the rural areas as the areas with fewer than 1,000 population, the average population size goes around 300, 400. In fact, when you look at the 1,000, the average population size declines from 400 something to 320. So basically the average population size declines slightly, but the whole picture doesn't change much. And this is basically the population trends in rural areas with less than 1,000 population. Again, we see the same picture. We see that majority lived in the urban area, population increased, the strong means increased, moderate means increased, weak means increased. It's only the remote areas that lost population. So this is the same picture that emerges when we look at the rural and small town definition. It doesn't change much. The numbers change slightly, but the whole picture that emerges, the conclusions that we draw, the observations that we make are going to be more or less the same irrespective of the definition of rural, the size, the population size that we choose to basically as a measure of rural and urban. Percentage distribution of the age distribution of the population. What we observe here is that the share of the younger folks, younger kids, declined during the 2001-2011. This is the aging process. Share of the 20 to 44, these are prime working age population, declined even though we experienced significant inflow of population in this during the 2006-11. But still the share of the working age declined. Share of the 45 to 64 increased, and the seniors stayed relatively constant because of the share of the working age population increased significantly. So this is an aging of the provincial population, which has significant budgetary implication for the province as the population gets older. The healthcare expenditure increases significantly, taxes decline, labor force declines, the productive capacity declines. So basically, the province will basically encounter budgetary problems, especially now that the commodity prices are also declining, so that causes another decline in the provincial revenue. Urban population, the same picture emerges when we look at the urban or rural population. The urban population, younger folks decline, the share of them, share of the prime working age population declines, share of the older workforce increases, and the share of the seniors increases. When we look at the rural population, the same picture emerges. Basically, the younger folks decline and the older ones increase. The older ones decline here because of the out-migration, as we're going to see later on, out-migration of older people, seniors, from rural areas to urban centers during the 2001-2006. Significant numbers of seniors moved out, either out of the province or out of the rural areas, went to the urban centers. Some socioeconomic indicators of the population in rural and urban Saskatchewan. These are the population 15 to 64. We observe that the unemployment rate is relatively low. This is 2011. Unemployment rate in urban areas is about 6.6. By the way, the unemployment rate in Saskatchewan in 2014, July 2014, reached a historical low of 3.3%, lowest in the country. So this was 2011, but when we move toward more remote areas, as the degree of rurality increases, the unemployment rate increases, becomes 20%, 19% in remote areas. Same time, participation rate declines as we go from urban centers to more rural areas. If you look at the same picture for rural and urban areas defined this way. So rural is defined as those places with less than 1,000 population. You observe the same phenomenon, almost the same, except that the unemployment rate is higher in smaller places. Even the census subdivisions that fall in the metropolitan areas, fall in the urban centers, have higher unemployment rate. The smaller ones have higher unemployment rate than the larger ones. And as the degree of rurality increases, the unemployment rate increases and the participation rate declines. Dependency rate, dependency on government transfers, 5% in urban areas, but then it goes to 7 and 11 and 11 and 10% as we move toward rural areas. So what is the reason for these high dependency rates in rural areas? Lower income, lack of job opportunities. When we look at the same picture, same phenomenon, for the different definition of rural, we observe the same trends. That is, the dependency is low in urban areas, a bit higher than 5% because we are looking at the smaller places, but then it increases as the degree of rurality rises. This is an important issue. This is an important picture. When we look at the education, when we look at the no certificate, the percentage of the population that doesn't have even a high school diploma, when we go to the rural areas, except for those that are very close to urban centers. My study of Northern Ontario, East and West, shows that in the Northeastern Ontario, when there is better communication system, when there is better access to education, Aboriginal population are better educated than in the Northwestern Ontario, because in Northwestern Ontario the remoteness and lack of access to education. Transportation system is not as well, the connectivity is not as well, so lack of access results in lower level of educational achievement. We do observe that here. Those that are closer to urban centers, rural areas, only 22%, 23% don't have high school diploma. But as we go farther away, when the access declines, when the distance increases, 29% don't have high school diploma, 30%, 33%. So basically 30% of rural population do not have high school diploma. Another 30% have maximum up to high school. So about 60% of them do not have they have up to high school diploma. Significant studies are showing that by 2030, 80% of jobs require some post-secondary education. If that is the case, then what do we do with these folks who have up to high school education? We can, of course, import skilled workers from other provinces or from other countries. That has become sort of a norm, that is mobile workforce. But then if that we can do and basically get by, because those workers are mobile, and we are the provinces do not want to create any more communities based on resource development. So basically the mobile workforce has become the norm. But then what would be the economic impact for these rural areas if these citizens, these residents cannot participate in the development of resources? Are we going to put them all on welfare? Significant social and economic problems if this picture doesn't change, if we don't invest in education, especially in rural areas of Canada. Employment, the percentage of population that have employment income basically declines from 87% in urban areas because employment opportunity declines. As we go into the rural areas, these are some employment income. Even if somebody worked for wages, 1 week, then that is considered as having employment income. So these are people who did part-time or full-time or part year or part week or part time for wages and salaries. So basically even that declines significantly as we go into rural areas. Wages and salaries. Wages and salaries decline. So the full-time wages, 58 in urban centers, and as we go into the rural areas, declines to 43. Average wage and salaries, these are employment earnings, decline from 45,000 to 32,000 in rural areas, remote rural areas. What does explain this significant earning gap between rural and urban areas? Is it human capital, content, level of education and skills, or is it distance from urban areas, which is referred to as economies of agglomeration? Larger centers provide higher productivity, provide higher wages. Before getting into that, let's look at some interesting observation on where do other population groups live. Basically, when we look at the population, the Francophone population, majority live in urban centers, and then 14 and 17%. This is different from Ontario, for instance. In Ontario, much higher percentage live in urban centers and very few live in rural areas. In Saskatchewan, apparently 14-15% here and 17% in relatively remote areas. Maybe it can be that these are those who are involved in resource industries. Those are the folks that basically Francophones who work in resource-based industries in those remote areas. When we look at the Aboriginal population, the off-reserve population, majority live in urban areas, and then the rest live in relatively remote areas. When we look at the on-reserve population, majority live in moderate and weak needs areas. 34 and 51 is 85, 86, 87% live in weak and moderately influenced areas. About 10% live in very remote areas. Immigrants, always been the case. In fact, in Ontario, a much larger percentage of immigrants live in urban centers. Here, immigrants, significant number of them are in urban centers, but we also have significant numbers, percentage shares that live in rural areas. In fact, one, as I mentioned before, one very interesting, these are people probably are working in resource-based industries. One very absolutely interesting phenomenon that has happened is that the average age of immigrants from 2001 to 2011 has declined significantly. In 2001, the average age of immigrants was 52. In 2011, the average age of immigrants is 42. What does that mean? That means that all of those people, immigrants who basically moved into the province, as we saw in that picture before, are much younger immigrants that have basically lowered the average age by 10 years, which is absolutely significant. So having discussed the geographical distribution of immigrants and Francophones and Aboriginals, let's get back to education. Let's develop a human capital index and see what percentage of the earning gaps between rural and urban areas are explained by human capital index. First, we estimated, we used the microdata for Canada. We used Canada here as a base. For other provinces, I used their own province, but then realized that if we use the Canadian data, then we have a benchmark that we can basically compare all provinces to each other, because then the benchmark would be the same as Canada. So here, and that's what we have done when we summarize all these reports. So for Canada, return to education, the benchmarks are those who don't have high school diploma. If one gets a high school diploma, the earnings will go up by 24.5%. If you get a trade diploma, your earnings go up by 27%. If you get a college diploma, your earnings go up by 44%. There is a difference between men and women. Here is on average, if you look at men and women, if you have trade diploma, then your average earnings will go significantly higher than 27%, because men specialize in the type of trades that have higher earnings, electrical, plumbing, all kinds of manual trades. Women get specialized in trades that are lower paid trades. That's why the return to trade is not as high as one basically imagines. This is men and women combined. So college 44%, university without a degree, bachelor degree 48%, and university is 72%. So basically, as the level of educational achievement increases, the return in terms of wages and salaries increases significantly. So we used, and these numbers can be perceived as return to productivity. That is, people with higher level of education are more productive. So if you consider these numbers as productivity indicators related to the level of schooling of different people, these are the return that market has paid people with different levels of education on average. So errors basically cancel each other out. These are averages. So if you consider these as productivity measures, then we use these numbers to calculate the human capital index. Therefore, the human capital index measures the percentage with different levels of education, and the levels of education are weighted by productivity measures. So the human capital index that we develop does indirectly or directly contain information related to the productivity when you become more educated. Let's look at the human capital index for rural and urban areas. Blue is Canada. So basically the human capital index is about 137, 1.37. So the range is between 1 and 2. 1 is if all the labor force have less than high school diploma. Everybody has less than high school diploma, then the index would be 1. If everybody has university degree, the index would be 2. So the index ranges from 1 to 2. For Canada is 137. And then for the strong means 133. So we see that the index, human capital index, declines as the degree of rurality rises. It becomes 117 in remote rural areas, which is really bad. The red one is Saskatchewan in 2011. So one obvious observation is that from 2001 to 2011, the human capital composition of the workforce in Saskatchewan has increased significantly from green to red. So we see them green to red. The only anomaly is that the very remote rural areas, the human capital content has declined from 2001 to 2011. The reason that I mentioned before is probably that many of those who had some sort of skills, improved economic conditions in other regions, they moved out. So basically, if they moved out, then the human capital content in very remote areas has come down because of the mobility movement of those with a higher level of skills to urban centers in search of employment. But overall, we see that for Canada, for total, the human capital index is 128. For instance, for Ontario is higher than this. For BC is higher than this. For Saskatchewan, for 2011 is slightly lower than Canada. So one of the goals that one can have is to try to improve the situation, the gap between the rural. This is in fact must be the case, must be one of the goals of the policymakers, to raise the level of human capital in rural as well as urban areas. Access is what makes it or breaks it. Lack of access basically is a major barrier to economic development and to basically improvement of the human capital content of the workforce. So this we have done for our provinces, and you also have the Canada here, so you can basically compare it over time and see what has been happening. Are the average earnings higher in urban centers because of economies of agglomeration, which basically suggests that people in bigger centers, firms and companies are more productive because they have access to larger pool of people, because they have access to better educated people, and therefore they pay higher wages. But when you look at this, that story does not hold that well because for instance, in this region, 7,500 to 10,000, income is higher than in this region. So basically there are other factors. So economies of agglomeration doesn't hold that well. In fact, the correlation coefficient, the simple correlation coefficient between average population size and average earnings is about 0.3. That means basically it's not really good. What about the human capital and the area size? What would that be? It's the relationship, the correlation, simple correlation coefficient between human capital and average earnings is about 80%, which is quite good. But it still is not perfect. It's not 100%. It's about 20% of the correlation should be explained or explained probably by other factors. What are those other factors? These are the other factors. Those living. So if your employment goes up by 1%, these are based on statistical regression analysis. Employment goes up by 1%, average income goes up by 0.4%. If human capital index goes up by 1%, average earnings goes by 0.8%. Primary processing, agriculture, those areas that are concentrated in these will have generally lower average earnings. Mining, those areas that are in mining, concentrated in mining, oil and gas, are having higher average earning, more 1% employment in higher employment in mining. It causes about 0.9% increase in the average earning in the area. Same manufacturing areas that have significant Aboriginal population have lower earnings because Aboriginal population generally have lower earnings. How do we measure the effect of human capital on the earning gap? First, let's concentrate on the blue bars. These are the geography, the agglomerations. It basically says these are all should be considered as negative. Like basically this looks nicer if you put it upward, but they're all negative. So in the area, the rural areas with a strong mix, about average earnings are about 2.5% less than urban areas. Urban areas are the benchmark. Rural areas with moderate link, average earnings are 17% less than urban areas. Weak link, 14-15% less than urban areas. And remote rural areas, average earnings are about 23-24% less than rural areas. When we include the human capital, this earning differential disappears. So human capital, the differences in the human capital composition of workforce in this area and urban area, it explains the difference between their income. Here, the difference, it declines the gap by 26-27%. So human capital composition of the workforce explains about 26% of the gap between the earnings. Here, 30% of the gap is explained by human capital. Here again, 30% of the gap is explained by human capital. Demographic change. Let's look at the projections. We are sort of 10 minutes to go. Birth minus death is the natural population change. So the population at 2011 minus population in 2001 is, as a result, changes in this, which has gone up generally, is either because of the birth minus death, natural population change, or in migration minus out migration, net migration. Fertility rates, basically, as I mentioned, in the average fertility rate, for rural Saskatchewan, the green one is about 2.4 children per woman. The blue line, the Saskatchewan overall is 1.9, and the red line is overall Saskatchewan. Red line is urban Saskatchewan is 1.78, the total fertility rate. Total fertility rate in Canada, the urban areas is about 1.5, and in rural areas is about 2.1. and overall is 1.6 as we saw before. So if the situation in 2001-2011 continues, we are going to observe that urban population increases by about 11%, 10%, 606 to 670 is about 11%. So it's about 11.2% increase in the population of urban areas in Saskatchewan. What is the result of this? What factors explain this relatively significant rise in population? The immigration and inflow of population. So as we see here, these are from 2001-2011. When we compare the 2001-2011 population, we see that these are the in-migrations. So we see the significant number of people between ages of 20 and 24 came here, 25. So basically has been significant inflow of all kinds of ages, but then some outflow here, but again very minimal in the upper tail of the distribution. The rural population is expected to decline, not dramatically, but if this good situation continues, the situation 2001-2011, then the rural population declines from 412 to 394, about 4%. About 4% decline. And what is the factor? These are the out-migration. These are the 20 to 30. These many people during 2001-2011 moved out of rural areas. Very interesting phenomenon we observe here, that these young people basically moved out of rural areas, but then we observe people coming into rural areas between ages 30 to 69, and then we again observe out-migration of people from 70 up, have moved out of the province, out of the rural areas. They have either gone into urban centers or out of the province altogether. Conclusion. Generally, aging of the population, the labor force, we discussed the impact of the aging population on the labor force. It reduces the ability of the province to generate output and income. Lack of qualified labor force in rural areas is a significant problem. Human capital in rural areas are human capital composition is lower. That causes problem in the long run. If we are to develop those areas, that basically means that we are going to import workers, and that reduces the significant economic benefits of those areas to the residents of those areas. Future jobs require higher level of education and increasing productivity. We can increase productivity and human capital linked to the productivity and level of income. Therefore, we can increase that by investing in education. This is an interesting and alarming chart that shows that the number of government studies in provincial studies that shows that in 2011, 70%, about 65 to 70% of jobs require post-secondary education. That is going to increase by 2031, 80% of jobs require some post-secondary education. These are nice charts that I usually show to my students. If you get university graduates, this is your lifetime earning profile. Men, these are women. Those two charts were basically the add-ons. Here we come back to the story. What percentage of the workforce in Saskatchewan has post-secondary education? Remember, 60 to 70% right now requires post-secondary education, 60 to 70, and in 15 years' time, 80%. So we see that in the overall, the population 15 to 64 in Saskatchewan, we are still below the required level of skills, education required for the jobs of now, of the present jobs. The unreserved population is significantly lower level of skills, education. Off-reserve, the same, higher, but still significantly lower. Francophone and immigrants have significantly higher level of skills at par with the level of education that is required right now. Percentage with post-secondary education in rural urban, see the urban is 53, is still lower than the skill requirement of today, but definitely lower than the skill requirements of tomorrow. The rural areas are much lower skilled, and then as we go into remote areas, degree of rurality rises, the percentage with post-secondary qualification declines. These are nice final charts. What happens when you get a secondary diploma? If you get a secondary diploma, your chances of getting a full-time job increase by 5–6%. Your chances of working more weeks, 6–7% more weeks per year. Your dependency, chances of probability or likelihood of dependency declines by 60%. Your likelihood of being poor declines by 40%, 46%. Your likelihood of being unemployed declines by 40%. Your participation increases by 19, men and women, to 32%, and earnings increase from 17 to 24%. What about trades? If you get a trade diploma, the same picture. There are benefits in terms of working more, working full-time, lower dependency, lower chance of poverty, lower unemployment, higher participation, and higher earnings. Finally, the last chart. What is the return to investment in education? What is investment in education? I'm spending 4, 5, 6 years of my time, which I could work at McDonald's and earn minimum wage, so I'm bypassing, by forgetting all that income that I could earn working at minimum wage. Then I'm also spending money to go to university and college, borrowing money, so that's a cost, direct cost, as well as foregone revenue. And then when I get a university degree, graduate from college, trade, university, or high school, then I basically start working and get higher wages for the rest of my life. So if I calculate the return to this investment, the cost I've incurred, the return to investment is significantly high, 20–30%, especially nowadays that return to your savings and investments are in the areas of 2–4%. These returns basically suggest that everybody should participate in education, and we should spend more money in education, making sure that rural and urban folks are good educated, better educated. Okay, that's it.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Dr. Mozami. Again, if anyone has any questions, feel free to type them into the question pane. I haven't seen any questions throughout the webinar. You're quite thorough, Dr. Mozami. So I'll just wait another 30 seconds or so, and if I don't see any questions, what I'll do is I will I'll send
You can
out.
always ask questions, yes.
Yep, yeah, and what I'll do is I'll send out
directly from me or directly from you, and then you can send it to me and I'll answer it.
Exactly. So after the webinar, I will send a follow-up email and send attendees your email address if they have further questions, if that works for you.
Definitely, definitely.
Okay, so we are getting around 2 o'clock, so I think we'll just end it here for now. And again, I'll send a follow-up email to everybody. And thank you very much, Dr. Mozami, for presenting, and thank you, everybody, for attending.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.